Hello, for those of you that are here. Hearing something in the background on somebody. Okay, still working on grading tests. That's what I was working on right up until just a minute ago. Not looking too bad so far, so don't stress too badly. The exams. Let's take a look at chapter 7 today. Somebody mentioned that the due dates were incorrect. I think they're correct. I wouldn't double check them. I saw one or two that I made a mistake on, but I fixed those. So double check those for me. Make sure that the due dates are sometime this week. They might have been yesterday if you haven't done something, but that's okay. You can still turn stuff in. I'm not going to count anything late that anybody's gets completed this week. Okay, even if that's right up to Saturday at midnight. Okay. Just get it done. So those assignments, let's just look at them real quick, okay, guys? This is the stuff that, and again, even if you haven't been able to successfully get the VPN working, I still need those screenshots. You know, some people are emailing me and saying, well, I couldn't get it working. Okay, well, submit that as the assignment so I can see what part you got stuck on. Submitting the VPN connection to the EI lab, or setting it up, excuse me. IP number and MAC address lookup, you should have already done that one. Access to the EI lab, these two right here go hand in hand. They have to be done together. Network cable lab, we cannot really do. So we're not going to do that one. Well, I'll probably have you guys watch a video or do something in place, or like a little assignment that gets you introduced to Cat 5 and the pinout of 568B. 568B is the pinout that we use, and I'll post a couple of links to videos, which I want you to watch. Actually, that's probably the best way to do that. Post you a link or two to the videos that show people how to make the cables, and then I'll ask, and then the assignment will be answer these questions on what you saw in the videos and how to make a cable. Even so, that way, it's I wish we could make the cables, but there's just not any easy way to do that. So don't worry about that one right now. I'll change that up. That one is watching a video, which you should have watched for exam 1, but that's not critical if you didn't watch that. Network game, again, we're gonna have to skip that one and do something else. So don't worry about that one. Here are the two subnetting ones, the subnetting first try and the subnetting assignment version 1.0G. That's the actual turn-in version. You do definitely need to do those by the end of the week. Saturday night, I believe I made them. Draw.io, also due by the end of the week. Packet Capture Lab, we'll do that next week. Don't worry about that. Okay. Can you guys all hear me okay? I didn't ask. I'm assuming that you can. Okay, at least one person said yes, so we'll assume. And I know I haven't gotten to everybody's email. I got a lot of emails yesterday. What about the extra credits? Don't worry about those for right now. Talk about those next week when you might really need them. Oh, I was already logged in. So the course content, let's go there, chapter 7 is, oh, and by the way, here's the RFPs. I'm not going to click on these right now, but I want you to look at each of these. There is, and let me show you how to read these first of all. Do you see sample RFPs on the screen there? Each one of these bid numbers relates to a particular bid, so you'll see that, and that. Those 4 files right there all relate to the same bid. because they're all bid 20-006 LJ. This one is these two here. Oh no, that one's by itself, and then there's two files there. So you'll notice that some bids, and actually let's just look at one of them. Okay, let's look at a simple one here. This is a bid for Fort Bend ISD, a request for proposal, an RFP. Common elements in the RFP is it's always going to give you some sort of background describing who the entity is. They're going to tell you about how they're going to conduct the process. Sometimes there's a conference where they can further explain, and there's a Q&A session for vendors. That's very important, especially on a complex bid. If it's something simple like we need 3,000 boxes of paper, that's not a big deal. But if it's we need you to help us design a new network or upgrade a network, there's going to be a lot of questions. Demonstration interviews, here's some special notes. General terms and conditions and requirements, there's going to be this. It's very important that the entity describe to the vendor as much as well as they can what the criteria is for who's going to get the bid and what they're looking for. Here's the evaluation criteria, as I mentioned. Interlocal agreements, special terms and conditions, if any. Let's keep scrolling. Now, these are going to be very big for school districts and state agencies because they have to have a lot of legal stuff in them that you won't see in a lot of commercial or corporate RFPs. So I want you to read through these. Now on this particular one, this is actually one of the simpler of the two. Let's get down to the meat of what it's actually asking us for. It's called LAN network equipment and related services. So since we're talking about LANs today, let's just take a look at this. The first few pages don't even indicate what they need. Here's the evaluation criteria. Notice, number one criteria, purchase price. As I said yesterday, in the case of government entities, that's kind of the number one criteria, as long as all the other criteria are minimally met. Timetable, oh, that's also important. I forgot to mention that. You've got to give your vendors the calendar of events and the timeline when things are going to be considered, when the absolute last date is to submit, date and time. You know, you'll have until noon on June 23rd to get the bid to us. At that point, we won't accept any more. They got to be delivered to our conference room or whatever it is. Okay, so here, summary, scope of work. That's usually what you're going to be looking for in an RFP is scope of work. What do you want the vendor to do? Fort Bend ISD requests proposals for LAN infrastructure, equipment, and related services. So not just equipment, but maintenance services. For this particular, well, that's actually just for certain schools, some new schools they're building, basically. There comes the timeline. And then further down, they more specifically state what they require or what they're requesting. Usually in the case of a LAN, they're going to request it on a per user basis as to what each student needs and whether there needs to be servers. So you see these get rather long. Now what FBISD does and what some, not all, but what some requesters do is they give you a spreadsheet. So you'll notice this bid number here, it's the same number here, and the bid here referred to, it says please refer to the attached spreadsheet. So they gave us a spreadsheet, which makes it a lot easier. We can basically download this spreadsheet while we're looking through this bid. And if you're still not exactly sure what they're looking for, look at the spreadsheet because it's going to be a line item. Quantity this many. What's the price? What's the total? Let's take a look at it real quick. Excuse me. Okay, I'm going to pull it up on the screen here. So here is the request for proposal for the LAN network equipment. Name and address, blah, blah, blah. Parts list. Yeah, let's look at that. Woo, look at all of that. and they're asking for some pretty big quantities on some of this. So you'll see here that in this case, not in every case, but in this case, they've already done a lot of homework and they've specifically narrowed it down to specific model numbers. So if you're a vendor that sells this stuff, or you're a turnkey vendor that wants to provide this stuff to the school, you know exactly right there. Go see what your reseller or your wholesaler or your Amazon price or whatever it is, see what your prices are on these things and fill out what your prices are on those quantities. So they've really done a real good job here. Now you'll notice in some cases, or maybe you won't notice this, I noticed this, like power cord, for example. Now, some of this is real technical. I know what this stuff means. Power cord, IEC 320 C13/C14. That means that's the generic 3-prong power cord that comes with 99% of computers that you buy, not laptops. I'm talking about desktop computers. They're requesting 20 of those now. I don't know if that means they want 20 extra, or are they just asking for 20 power cords to fit with those, these devices here, like maybe that, I don't know. But that would be one of those things where you may not need to give them a price on that because it's supposed to be included. In fact, they don't even have a selling price over here. They're kind of saying, hey, this needs to be in there with it. 10 base G, so 10 gigabit. They want their workstations or these devices to be connected with 10 gigabit connection, so pretty good stuff. They're big on Cisco. Pole mount kit. Oh yeah, see, they want 200 wireless access points between these, I believe it was 4 schools they were building. So anyway, look at this stuff. Don't just gloss over it. Actually read through one or more of these RFPs because it'll give you a very good idea. And there's 2 or 3 questions on exam 2 with respect to RFP. You might only get 1, you might get 2, you might get all 3. So make sure you look at these. Also, as I said, in your business or in your proposed line of work after you get a degree here, I guarantee you this stuff I'm showing you on the screen right now is exactly like what you're going to be either creating or perhaps filling out for your company, or if you're supporting and selling stuff to another company. So there's the parts. So let's look at services. Okay, so the services are more a little bit different. A little more abstract to it. But it's generally the same thing, and they're just saying estimated cost. And now, usually when they estimate cost, or they ask you to estimate a cost, with the light here, they're asking you to give them a cost per year. I don't know if it says that here, but it probably does say that in the bid. It will say, give us the estimated monthly recurring cost per year is what they're typically talking about with respect to services. Okay, so I know I said I wasn't going to look at show you those, but I wanted you to see those. Okay, so wired and wireless LANs. Let's talk about wired and wireless LANs today. How many people in here, by the way, have a wired LAN at their current location that you're using, not just a wireless LAN, but you have a wired LAN for some reason? Anyone? Nobody? Give you a little bit more time to respond. But some people, some entities, even some individuals choose to use wired LANs and wire up their homes. And a lot of the newer homes that you buy, by the way, that did not open, oh, there it is, that you buy are pre-wired. I just helped a friend of mine the other night. He bought a house about 3 years ago. It was pre-wired for LAN connections, but he'd just been using the Wi-Fi And he called me a couple days ago and says, hey, Jake, man, I'm getting terrible lag on my television when I try to watch CBS All Access or Netflix. And the Wi-Fi service is terrible. Well, he didn't say the Wi-Fi service was terrible. He said the networking service was bad, and he was attributing it to the internet. He was saying, oh, Comcast sucks. You know, I'm paying for 75 megabit service and it's crawling. Should I spend a bunch more money and upgrade to 100 megabit? And that's, of course, Comcast is, or Xfinity, I should say Xfinity. By the way, do you guys understand that Xfinity is the same thing as Comcast? It's just the consumer grade version of it. Okay, and the Xfinity X5 is nothing special. I know I look like a floating head today, don't I? A little scary. Don't look at me. Look at the screen I'm sharing. So he assumed that it was the internet connection. I was getting very upset with them, and some companies also do that. They improperly attribute a performance issue with the wrong networking component. So I went over there, found that his wireless adapter, his wireless gateway, he was using one that he bought, but it was in a closet. It's a one-story house, first of all. It was in a closet of a guest bedroom, which was very far away from anything else in the house, on the other side of a garage. Hang on one second. I think I heard somebody come in my lab. One second. Checking stuff? I'm doing a Zoom meeting right now. Do you have any idea what's water in this room? Okay. I got you. Thanks. All right. Just some AC, guys. Sorry about that. Okay, and the fire alarm's probably going to go off in a minute or two, so don't freak out. So the point is his gateway device in the one-story house was kind of tucked in a corner far away from everything else. I looked in the closet there and noted that he had a bunch of wires feeding, a bunch of Ethernet wires, Cat5e Ethernet wires. They were all labeled family room, bedroom 1, bedroom 2, blah, 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 this and that and the other. And I said, well, here's what we need to do. So I went into the family room where his TV was. There was a wall plate on the wall. He says, I don't know what's behind there. Take the wall plate off. There's Ethernet cables back there. We pull the Ethernet cables out. We plug them to the back of the TV. Most TVs, not all of them, but most TVs have a LAN Ethernet connection. We plugged that in, told him, go turn off the Wi-Fi. And suddenly he's streaming like a devil. And everything's, you know, Netflix coming in great. And he's like, oh my God, Jake, you know, this is wonderful. What do I owe you? I should have asked for some money, but it was simple. I didn't do much. And of course I plugged the other end, the cable, and I plugged that into one of the open ports on his gateway. The other thing I noticed, and before I even did that, I did a survey using Wi-Fi Analyzer, which is, I want to show you this tool. And I'm not sure if I showed you. This is actually, I don't think I showed anybody this semester. Wi-Fi network analyzers. Now, for those of you with Apple iPhones, sorry, you're out of luck. There may be something called a Wi-Fi analyzer, but you can't run these kinds of tools on iPhones or Macs. You can only run them on Androids or PCs. But there's multiple apps that have something to do with Wi-Fi analyzing, and they will generate charts like this on both the 2.4 and 5.0 gigahertz range. So the very first thing I did is I walked into his house, walked right to the closet where the wireless device was, turned on the Wi-Fi analyzer, and his wireless device should have been the most powerful thing, should have been right up here. It was about here. It wasn't very powerful, first of all, so he didn't buy a real good one. Secondly, there was a whole bunch of other crap. I mean, more than this. His neighbors, other stuff going on, other things in the house. In other words, these are all, each one of these names here, has anybody ever used this program before? Anybody have an Android in here? This is one of the extra credit assignments, by the way, which, sorry to say, it's only available to people that have an Android, which, by the way, that's why I have multiple extra credit assignments. If you really want to do this, and I highly recommend this, find yourself if you're a Mac person or an iPhone person, find yourself an old Android. It doesn't even have to be connected to T-Mobile or Sprint or Verizon. Maybe you have a sibling or a friend that upgraded to the Galaxy S10 and they have an old S8 or an S7. They'll just give you a lot of times, even if it's a cracked screen or whatever. Because those you can still connect to Wi-Fi and download all the apps that you want, Wi-Fi Analyzer being one of them. And this becomes a very powerful tool which you can walk around with and sniff out Wi-Fi. You can't necessarily get on these Wi-Fis, but you can check their signal strength. So anyway, I checked his 2.4 gigahertz range, and there was maybe a dozen of his neighbors, because it was a fairly small house and they're close together in these new neighborhoods, who had stronger signals than his own device. So they were interfering. I flipped over to the 5 gigahertz range, which his device did do 5 gigahertz, and there wasn't nearly as much. But, and we're going to learn this today, later on in chapter 7, that the 5 gigahertz range, there's 2.4 and 5.0, not to be confused with 5G, by the way. Okay, 2.4 and 5.0 gigahertz ranges are radio ranges, not to be confused with something called 5G. That is a marketing term. Okay, 2.4 gigahertz, we write it like this, GHz, 5.0 GHz. Those are actually radio ranges. Actually, it's like 2.35 to 2.42. It's a small range there. 5.0, usually better because it's higher frequencies, in other words, more waves per second. That's what gigahertz means. By the way, a hertz, what is a hertz? A car rental company? No, it's not a car rental company. Well, it could be a hertz. Actually, it's a hertz. Hertz is one wave. So one wave per second equals 1 hertz. Okay. I'm getting ahead a little bit, but I'm talking about Wi-Fi first, more so than LANs, because you guys are familiar with Wi-Fi. And maybe some of you have had this realization before. So if you're at somebody's house or at your own house, you may have 2 different wireless SSIDs. You might have Netgear 38 and a Netgear 38-5.0 or -5. What is that? Well, that's the 5 gigahertz radio range. It's like the difference between AM and FM radio, for those of you that actually still listen to your radio in your car. There's pros and cons to either one. 2.4, the waves can reach further, okay? But it's a crowded space because it's, you know, it's legacy. It's been around a while. 5.0, a much bigger range, because the frequencies are, there's twice as many frequencies, twice as many hertz, waves per second. You can get twice as many bits through the radio wave, so you can get higher throughput. So at first I switched them over to 5.0 on the TV set because it would do that. Still wasn't any better. And that's because when I pulled up the Wi-Fi analyzer signal and I clicked over here to switch into the 5.0 range, his little bump was even lower on the range. It wouldn't reach the, you know, the 90 feet to the back of his house where his family room and TV set were. So I said, look, turn Wi-Fi off. You've got cabling. Let's use your cable. Made a difference of night and day. Now there are some other ranges. There's some new range like this 5G that you keep hearing about, by the way, actually is a combination of 2.4 and 5.0 and 6.0 and 60 gigahertz per second in varying strengths. Now, 60 gigahertz, you don't want that to have a very strong signal because that's a similar range that we use for microwaving food. But we only are transmitting at a very, very low frequency. So 5.0, the higher the ranges, keep this in mind, with frequencies, the higher the frequencies, the harder it is for them to penetrate solid objects. And this is really easy for you guys to understand. How many people have been driving down the road and some car drives up next to you and all you hear is boom, 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 boom. You hear the bass coming out of the car because they've got some 18-inch Rockford Fosgates in the trunk or whatever. That's very low frequencies. The bass or the subwoofers in a stereo, we're talking about 80 to 160 hertz waves per second. They're impacting your ears. Fewer waves like that, fewer waves can, and lower frequencies can transmit through solid objects much better. They can go through solid objects. Really, really high frequencies, like tweeters and things like that, can't go through, they don't bounce well. They can't go through solid objects. So the same holds true for 5 gigahertz as well as 60 gigahertz. And this is why you keep hearing all these negatives about the 5G, not just that it's supposedly frying your brain and causing COVID, which is a lot of crap. That's not happening. In order to use this new 5G suite of ranges, to get that maximum 60 gigahertz frequency, you're going to have to be within a few hundred feet or less of a transmitter. So that's why it's so expensive. That's why Verizon is making a big deal out of their 5G that they're rolling out, because it's costing them several $1 billion to basically put a little antenna on every other telephone pole, every building out there, in order to get you that higher speed. So keep that in mind, that high frequencies, positive, high speed. That's because more waves per second equals more bits per second. The negatives can't go through stuff. Doesn't go through metal very much at all. Can go through walls a little bit. Doesn't go through people very well. Or it stops in the middle of people and potentially causes cancer. Hope not. So keep those items in mind. So I was able to solve his problem just by wiring him up. Now, the issue with wired LANs, and the reason why, at least in home situations, that you see wireless is because we don't typically need the wired situation. Also, wiring tethers you. You're stuck to the wall, basically, by a cable. And it's harder to install, especially if the house has already been built. So that's why I asked earlier, has anybody ever installed or run a network of wires? It's difficult to do it, especially in houses. I hate to do it. I don't mind doing it so much in buildings because we have drop ceilings. You know, the tile ceilings, which you can usually push the tiles out. By the way, that's kind of unique to the United States only. I've noticed when I've gone to India and other countries that they don't use drop ceilings. Anybody here from a foreign country can attest to that matter? I'm talking about office buildings, not homes, but office buildings. Mexico even. You go into an office building in Mexico, a concrete ceiling. You're like, how the F am I supposed to put cabling here? And what you'll see is they will put the cabling in conduits that they put through the ceilings and walls before they built them, or there's a bunch of cables zip tied to the ceiling and the walls in tubes that you can see, they're visible. So anyway, why do we use a LAN? First of all, LAN stands for Local Area Network. Not the same thing as a subnet. Okay, subnet is grouping by IP address. This is grouping at the data link layer, layer 2. We want to share information between 2 or more nodes, between 2 or more people. It helps us improve decision making. It reduces data duplication and inconsistency by having the data stored in one location on a server, for example. So everybody goes to that one server for the master data. Resource sharing. Perhaps you have a printer on your desk or a printer in your office, and somebody else in the area, in the business, wants to use or needs to use your printer. It's a good way to connect yourself to that printer. Software sharing. Some software can be purchased on a per seat basis and reside on a server, and you essentially check out a copy of that software, and X amount of people be using it at one time. It's called multi-tenancy. By the way, you do need to know that term. Type that down. Network, with respect to networking, if you go Google for networking, multi-tenancy. It's the idea that you only have to buy licenses for software for the amount of users that are going to be using that application at any one time. For example, if you have some very expensive CAD drawing software, and sometimes that stuff can be $20,000, $30,000. Maybe you have 50 engineers that work for you, but only maybe 20 are working at a time that need to use that software. So you might only buy 20 seat licensing for that and use a server to dole out those licenses, basically. And then device management. That's another really good reason why we have things connected to networking, which you might wonder to yourself, so why are we LANifying, or why are we connecting our air conditioning system to the internet or the LAN? Why are we connecting our lighting system to the LAN? Why do we connect refrigerators to the LAN? Things like that. It's so that, or even just other networking equipment. Why do we connect it to networking? So that we can log into it and manage it and do stuff with it. Some devices let you power them off and on because they have a LAN switch. Very powerful stuff. Usually the number one thing that's done by network managers when something goes wrong is we turn the power off and back on, or we press Control-Alt-Delete. Most effective thing you can do, by the way. So whenever my dad calls, the first thing I say, did you press Control-Alt-Delete? No, I didn't do that. And it fixes 99% of his problems. Here are the components of a LAN. You have the clients, and this is not you necessarily. You are a user, an end user, or maybe you're not an end user, maybe you're a creator of the data, but you're a user. The client is the device that you use. Now, most clients are interacting one at a time with one user, but there are some client devices which don't have a direct single user, such as a camera, for example. The camera is considered a client device and a server device, kind of depending on what you're doing with it. It depends on whether it's gathering data, which does make it a client. If it's receiving data from the outside world and then taking that data and putting it on a server somewhere. So when you look at it that way, that is a client because your client computer is doing the same thing. You're taking data out of your head, typing it in the keyboard, and sending it off into a file somewhere. So usually that's workstations, but not always. Servers. Servers are devices that are usually receiving the data or storing the data, or maybe they're special purpose devices, special use devices like printers, where they're used to output. Printers, many times, network printers, we typically run printer server programs in the background of our computers to talk to printers. And then we have something called NICs, or network interface cards, or these days most network managers just refer to the networking port, whether it's an actual physical port on the back of the computer or an antenna, which is the case with most workstations these days. We call it an interface, IF, or a NIC, network interface card. These used to be, and the reason we called them cards is back in the old days with old PCs, they did not come with networking ports. You bought an expansion card which went into a slot which had a network port on it, or maybe 2, or maybe 4. Some computers have 4, 8, or 12. I've got a server over here that has 16 network ports on it. You might wonder, why does it have 16 network ports on it? Well, it's a server. It needs to have 16 freeway lanes into it to be able to talk to 16 different networks, potentially. And then you have the network cabling, or I should say, not necessarily the cabling, the media. That really should say the network media, because it's not always cabling. Sometimes it's radio waves, but that's the same item 4 there. There's 6 components here. Then you have the interconnecting devices, which could be called various different things, And I'll go through the order of complexity from least complex to most complex. They're called things like hubs, switches, routers, access points, gateways. Those are all similar things. They're connecting devices. They are not clients, they are not servers. There's something in the middle that helps glue these two guys together. And then finally, you have the networking software, which used to be separate software that you would purchase and put on your client computers and your server computers. But these days, it's usually built into the operating system. Clients, these are devices on the network that request information from servers. The servers, devices on the network that deliver information or provide services to clients, such as printing. The network interface cards, also called network cards, network adapters. They operate at layer 1 and 2. They can operate at layer 3, but for purposes of LANs, they operate at layer 1 and 2. Commonly built into the systems, into the motherboards. Each NIC in a computer contains a unique media access control address. That's that hardware, that 12-digit address with numbers in it, with letters in it that you've looked up before. Here's different categories of wiring. The most common wiring scheme that I see out there still, and it's been around about 25 years, is Cat5e. We don't say category anymore, it says Cat5e. Now, if you actually were to obtain some networking wiring like this, or if you had some in your home, or the next time you do happen to go to Walmart, go to the electronics area where they sell network wiring, or even Home Depot. Actually, that's probably better. Go to a Home Depot. I might even assign this, since I have to assign something for the cable assignment. Go to Home Depot, go to their networking section. You'll probably have to ask somebody. It's usually in the back corner of the store, and they will sell patch cables, which are pre-made network cables like this one. It's only 4 feet long. And then they'll also sell bulk cabling, which is a big spool of 500 or 1,000 feet of these various different flavors. Category 3 maybe, although I rarely see category 3 anymore. That's old school telephone wiring from 40 years ago. Cat 5. Sometimes I still see Cat 5, and not for sale, but I see it in the ceilings and in buildings. It's already in walls when I'm upgrading networks. Cat 5e is usually the common thing that's sold. These terms, and that's, some people miss this on the test. UDP stands for unshielded twisted pair. STP is shielded twisted pair. Here are the maximum data rates, and actually what's missing off this chart, which really should be on this chart, is relative distances. Category 5 wire, for example, can handle 100 megabits per second, but only to 300 meters. Or only do 100 meters, aka 328 feet. Cat 5e can handle gigabit connections, but again, only reliably to 100 meters, aka 328 feet between your device and some other device that's powered, like a switch or a router. These first 4 are electrical media. They use copper. It's copper wiring. Now, I do want you to know, for purposes of exam 2, the difference between these various wire types. So if you just Google for Cat 5e UTP, you can see lots of data on it. That's what it looks like inside. There's a Cat 5 wire. It's actually using 8 wires, 8 individually wrapped copper wires, and here is a common color scheme. This is the TIA standard. TIA and IEEE are the standards making bodies that help us decide what the thickness of wires should be and what these colors are. So there's a white orange orange pair, a white blue blue pair, a white green green pair, and a white brown brown pair. And we follow either the 568A or the 568B specification when we're shoving these wires into connectors, into CRIP connectors. This is copper wire, by the way. Anybody know what some of the properties of copper are? Copper's nicely conductive. That's why we use it for electrical wiring. We don't use aluminum. We don't use steel in network wiring. We do use steel in some cases, like in the case of coax, but not for unshielded twisted pair. This twisting, by the way, helps to reduce the extra frequencies from interfering with the wiring. This is DC power. Okay, you're probably learning more than you ever want or need to know about networking here, but Ethernet, which is data layer 2. It's actually layer 1 and 2. Actually, I shouldn't say the word Ethernet. Modern networking, which uses layer 2 Ethernet. Those cables, Cat5, Cat5e, the power on the cables is DC power. That means there's a positive and a negative. Think about a battery. And we're only talking about 1 to 2 volts of power. Barely as much power as in one single AA battery. We don't pass a lot of voltage through those wires because 1, those wires are very thin. 2, we don't need to pass that much voltage through those wires to get those Ethernet frequencies through the wire. We can pass much higher voltages DC power-wise through those wires if we want. There's a thing called power over Ethernet, which if you use power over Ethernet hardware, it eliminates the need to have an extra power connection into that device. For example, like a phone or a camera. As long as you can get an Ethernet wire to it and you take that Ethernet, and I shouldn't say Ethernet wire, as long as you get a Cat5 wire to it, you plug that Cat5 wire at the other end, 100 feet away, let's say, to a switch that is called a PoE switch, or has that specification. It's actually putting out either 24 or 48 volts of power. The frequency has nothing to do with the power of a signal. That refers to the number of waves per second. Power is the height of the wave. What's the voltage? That's called amplitude or power. If you want to know just a little bit about waves, there's 3 properties of waves. Frequency is how many waves per second. Amplitude is how high the waves are, how tall the waves are, I should say. Audibly, if you were to use an oscilloscope or use a meter that monitored my talking, if I start talking high like this, you will notice that the waves, the frequency waves, are much closer together. Get a bunch of waves that are real close together. But if I start talking lower, the waves spread out. They're further apart. If I start talking really loud, the waves get higher and lower like this. And if I start talking really quietly, you can barely hear me. The waves are just like this. So, don't need to know that too much.
So, the sounds changes based on the voltage?
The voltage for networking, for Ethernet networking, doesn't matter. And because Ethernet is basically FM radio, or at least when I say Ethernet, that's a layer 2 data link protocol, which is a combination of layer 1 and layer 2. Most Ethernet is using FM radio waves, and the frequencies are much higher than Wi-Fi to get our 1s and 0s across the line. We intentionally don't send high voltage through those wires because high voltage is dangerous and flammable. DC power, by the way, for those of you that don't know, is much more dangerous than AC power. 100 volts of DC power will kill you quicker than 100 volts of AC power. Anybody ever been shocked by a wall outlet? When you were a kid or whatever, you were curious and stuck a fork in the wall? Maybe. Hurt. Probably didn't kill you, but it hurt. 100 volts of DC power might knock you unconscious. 200 volts of DC power will probably kill you, depending on the amperage that you're drawing, like how wet you are, basically. Anyway, don't want to get too much more into the explanation of frequencies. You can look those up, and it better helps you understand why we do certain things the way we do. But So PoE, power over Ethernet. It's difficult sometimes to get multiple wires, or we don't have. How many of you, by the way, have camera systems in your homes that you know of? Or have some remote monitoring devices that are wireless, or they're networking devices? And when you install them, you had to figure out, well, okay, how am I going to get power up there to it? You might want to put a camera out on your garage or whatever, like a Ring doorbell system or a Ring system. Some of them are battery operated. You got to run power to them somehow. Then if it's doesn't have wireless networking, not all equipment has wireless networking built in, you got to somehow get networking to it. So rather than run two physical networks and two physical cables, because the power network, electrical power is a network, just like Ethernet networking. So PoE lets you just run one cable. It's easier. By the way, what is this wire? This is, you guys see this wire that I'm showing? I know it's hard to see it, but this is a patch cable. It's really incorrect to call this an Ethernet cable. A lot of people call this an Ethernet cable because you can connect it to an Ethernet switch and it'll feed Ethernet networking, but that's a data link layer or layer 2 protocol. If I decide to do something different with this cable, like I decide to hit you with it if you were here, or tie up a bad guy with it, or put it around my neck and wear it as a tie, then it's not an Ethernet cable, is it? It's just a weird fetish thing, isn't it? My point is, by that funniness there, is that this is a physical layer protocol known as Cat5 in this case. And it literally says it. This is why I say go to Home Depot, find where they sell the big boxes of cable in the back, pull out a little bit of it, stick it back, don't make a mess for them. And you will literally see writing on the cable that will say Cat V or Cat 5 or Cat 5E or Cat 6 wiring. And it might say UTP, STP, it might be really thick. And there's different sub categories of Cat 5 and Cat 6 wiring, which is what I was trying to show you here. Like, for example, this wiring here, this is outdoor Cat 5e UTP. Not only does it have an extra sheathing on the inside of it, which helps protect it from the elements, it's got a channel inside here which helps to channelize or keep the pairs away from each other. Each one of these pairs has positive and negative voltage on them, and they have signals which can be interfering with each other. But if we channelize them or keep them separate, where they're not all twisted around each other individually, we can get the signals to go further. Cat 6 wire, by the way, Cat 5 uses 24 AWG, American wire gauge. Cat 5e, you don't need to know this for the test, 24 gauge wire. Cat 6 uses 23 gauge wire. I'm sure I'm spelling gauge wrong. The lower the gauge number, by the way, the thicker the wire is. Battery cables in your car that go from your battery to your car engine, what gauge do you think those wires are? They're real thick. They're like 4 or 6 gauge. Big around as your pinky or your index finger. You can carry a crap ton of voltage on those, 10,000 volts, 20,000 volts, enough to fry you real quick. So you will encounter lots of different flavors of Cat 5, Cat 6, and yes, there is Cat 7 and Cat 8, although I don't see Cat 7 sold. You can't usually buy that at Home Depot. You can't even usually buy Cat 6 at Home Depot. Since we're talking about media types, I'll go ahead and keep talking about it. How much do you think 1,000 feet of Cat 5e wire costs? It usually comes in a roll of 1,000. Let's just check good old Amazon.com here, or shopping.com. 1,000 feet of Cat 5e. Now that's really expensive, by the way. And that's because it's got special plenum coating. It ranges, wow, that's real cheap. 1,000 feet of shielded twisted pair Cat. I'm gonna go buy that right now if that's really that cheap. Normally it's going to be about 60 to 70 bucks a box. Let's see why that can be so cheap. It's interesting what you learn when you just surf through Home Depot in the electronics department or on Amazon.com. So this says 1,000 feet of 24 gauge. There's a 24 gauge Cat 5e cable, gray. The color doesn't matter, by the way, on the outside. We don't typically care. This inside color matters, but the outside doesn't matter. Why is it this cheap? Because I tell you, copper is expensive. Copper metal is expensive. Pennies haven't not been made of copper since 1984. They're made of zinc, which is a much more common material, by the way. Doesn't get very high review. Well, there's actually not much review. I will almost guarantee you, I can't see any specifications on this. But I guarantee you, okay, here, let's look here. Twisted pair 24 AWG, 125 megabit network transmission speed. So that's only 100 megabit that they're rating it for. It's very low rating. So it's probably just Cat 5. It's probably misnamed. Designed for only 100 megahertz with 100 megahertz worth of frequency. We can't get more than 100 megabits per second through there. Let's look at Amazon.com. Home Depot has probably incorrect or invalid information. Cat 5e bulk cable. So it ranges wildly. This is a good number to look at, that megahertz rating. 350 megahertz, 500 megahertz, 600 megahertz. If it's 600 megahertz, that's Cat 6A or Cat 6E wiring. You can get 10 gigabit per second through that. Here's some that's real cheap. Let's look at this and figure out why this is so cheap, because I'll tell you the cheapest that I buy Cat 5e at my wholesale prices is about 70 bucks a box, 60 to 70 bucks. There it is right there. There's the answer. Never ever buy cable that costs less than 60 bucks a box and think you're getting a good deal. You are buying CCA wire. And the only reason I'm mentioning this now to you guys is because it might not mean anything to you right now, but 2 or 3 years from now, when you're getting bids from companies to install networking and LAN equipment, some will come in with real low numbers for the wiring. Oh, that looks pretty good. Really low wiring, and that's because they're using this shitty cable. Copper clad aluminum. Always stay away from it. Does anybody happen to know the property differences between copper and aluminum? Aluminum is much less conductive. Aluminum is lighter weight and cheaper. It's much more common. We make it out of bauxite, which there's tons of that in Puerto Rico and other parts of the world. But aluminum rusts more than copper. It breaks more than copper. It doesn't, you can't get, it's not very conductive, in other words. Copper clad aluminum literally means it's like the pennies of today. If you look at a penny, it looks like it's copper. If you taste it, you ever taste a penny? Lick a penny? No? Some people do. There's a certain taste to copper. You can literally taste copper. It has a weird taste to it. Come on, I know everybody's tried a penny, licked a penny before. Clean it off first. Only the first few microns, the very first few molecules of depth in that modern penny are copper. The rest of it is zinc or some cheaper metal, and that's what this stuff is. And manufacturers try to hide it, and like that Home Depot wire for 37 bucks, I guarantee you that is copper-clad aluminum. Stay away from it. So 3 years from now, when you're getting bids on networking, hopefully you will remember this stuff and go, oh yeah, I remember Jake saying something about wire under 60 bucks for 1,000 feet. It's crap wire, don't use it. I hope you remember some of this stuff. Otherwise, kind of move on saying any of this. But where's PowerPoint? Okay, now these last two here, these are called OM or optical media. These are literally fiber optic wire. Fiber optic wiring is literally made of glass or plastic. It's using light, ultraviolet light, to transmit the data, the frequencies can be much, much, much higher. All transmissions are transmitted in waves, are audio, not the way you're hearing me now, but if we were talking in person, we are speaking in a frequency range, somewhere between 400 to 1200 hertz. Okay, in fact, you can download, if you have an Android or an Apple, you can download frequency tone generator programs or frequency frequency detection apps, so that when you talk into it, it will literally tell you at what frequencies, not one frequency would be like the middle C on a piano, I think, is 880, or it's either 440 or 880 hertz, I can't remember. You will see the frequency changing. Play around with that. It helps you conceptually to understand this frequency crap. So sound waves, very low frequencies. As a matter of fact, we used to use sound to transmit data. That's called modems. We used to use, well, I'll show you this, guys, later. But we used to use old school modems, which would convert sound into bits, and we could get 300, 600, 1200 bits per second. Very slow. Then we started using direct current, DC power across the wire to transmit at much higher frequencies, which we don't hear as humans, but we don't need to hear it. You don't need to hear your electricity. You just need to see what it's doing. And then finally, light is very, very, very high frequency radio waves. Light is very similar to radio waves, but it's just very high, much higher, and it manifests itself not as sound, not as a radio frequency, but as light that our eyes can see, but not all of them. We can't see all the range of light. We see a very narrow range of light. Most animals see a much greater range of light than we do. The ultraviolet light, which is used for this fiber, is much higher, aka more frequency per second. We don't need to see it. Our computer equipment needs to see it. By the way, here's an interesting thing you can do, an interesting experiment that has to do with light that you can't see. When you go home tonight, for those of you that still have a television with a remote control is using light that you can't see. It uses infrared light below our range. Take your remote control, point it at you. There's a little light, a little LED in the end of it. You may not see it. It might be behind a little door. Point it at your eyes and then push the button. You're not going to hurt yourself. See if you can see anything. I guarantee you won't see anything. Then take your cell phone, turn the video on, point the remote control at the camera on your phone, take a few second video, and then look at it, and you will see some flashing. That's because your video camera on your cell phone sees better than you. It will pick up that light and change its frequency to a visible spectrum frequency. Interesting? No? Yes? Maybe? I think it's creepy as crap. When I first noticed that, I said, holy shit, I can see, what is this? I can see my remote control. Why do we use, for remote control, by the way, why do we use infrared light? Because it's not harmful. It's not using radio waves. And that's one thing that we have to understand with radio waves. Why there's only a 2.4 and a 5.0 gigahertz range and then a 6.0 gigahertz range, because radio waves are controlled very carefully. I'll talk about hubs and switches in a minute. Actually, let's go ahead and skip past. Radio waves are controlled very carefully here, because radio waves, unlike light waves or infrared, can be potentially dangerous. That's why people that wear pacemakers aren't supposed to be anywhere near a microwave oven, because the microwave oven might affect their pacemaker. For those of you that don't know this, a pacemaker is actually two pieces. One of the pieces sits inside your chest cavity and is actually sending a little electrical shock to the heart, and then basically the battery part sitting outside the chest cavity, and they're very close to each other. Your battery's usually like underneath your anybody know anybody with a pacemaker? Grandpa or somebody with a pacemaker? They'll have like a little lump here underneath their armpit. That's where the battery is. periodically, has your grandpa ever had to have his batteries changed? They literally have to go in there and they cut under the skin and they take the battery pack out and put a new battery pack in. They do that because, well, geez, if you had to change batteries in a pacemaker, you'd have to crack your chest open. So yeah, it's so changing the batteries, Nicola, it was not as harrowing an experience as cracking the chest open and put it in a pacemaker, I would think, or do open heart surgery. But those use radio waves to communicate. Infrared light is cheap and free, and anybody can make stuff. You don't need to have permission. You don't need to apply for an FCC license in this country, or an ICC license, or every country has different licensing that you have to apply for before you can make equipment that emits radio waves. Don't have to with light rays and infrared. So we use infrared because of that. And also, if we used a visible light spectrum to change the television station on our TV, it would be kind of annoying. It would be a bunch of flashing all the time. What's that flashing? Don't worry about it. It's just me changing the channel. Try this as an experiment also when you get home. I know these are silly things, but they're interesting. They just help you be a better person, I promise. Take the remote control, and instead of pointing at your TV, point it at a wall, a white wall in your house. And infrared bounces really well. It's very low frequencies. What did I say earlier about low frequencies? They go through and they bounce much better. You can point the infrared remote control, as long as it's a light colored, fairly flat surface, it will reflect off that nicely and change the channels on your TV. Now try to point it at something dark, like if you're wearing a dark shirt or a black chair or something in your room, and see if it will bounce off of that. Chances are it won't bounce off of that. Okay, so enough of that. Let's get back to this chapter 7. Let's see if we can get through it. There's more to wired and wireless LANs, and I know a lot about this stuff, and I like to talk a lot about it, so that's why I do. Okay.
Quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, no, I just thought it was interesting that the price for fiber optic is significantly higher than.
Well, why do you think it's significantly higher?
No, yeah, I mean, I just didn't think it was that much more expensive, but yeah, it's.
No, fiber optic wire, very expensive. In order to make fiber optic wiring, you have to make it in an environment that's 300 times cleaner than an operating room. And that's because fiber optic wiring must be very clear. You can't get a hair in it or a bit of dust in it or whatever, because as soon as that light travels, a couple miles and it hits that bit of dust, the light just breaks apart or reflects off of it basically, and you lose your signal. So this fiber optic wiring, and only a few companies in the world make it. Dow Corning, for one, makes fiber optic wiring. It has to be made in a very, very, very sterile environment, because it's not electrical waves. It's just light. It's like looking through a telescope. Anybody ever looks through binoculars and you're like, what's that big giant black blob in the sky? Oh, it's just some little schmutz on the front of the binoculars. It's amplified because of that. So you wipe that off and suddenly, oh, I can see much clearer. Or even your glasses. Anybody wearing glasses and going, oh, there's a UFO in the sky. Oh no, it's just some crap on my glasses. Anyway, fiber optic wiring, much more expensive. With Ethernet, Cat5, E-cable, we're talking like 10 cents a foot, 7 cents a foot. With fiber optic, we're talking $5 a foot. Much more expensive. That's why we don't use it a lot unless we really need those high speeds. Okay, so here's interconnecting devices. Now the book is kind of old on this stuff, and the pictures from the PowerPoint are terrible. So I'm going to show you some interconnecting devices. We'll start at layer 1. You have devices called hubs, or a hub. What does a network hub look like? Well, let's go Google for one real quick. You can't usually buy network hubs anymore. They're very, very old technology. Nice thing about most Ethernet is it's downward compatible. Oh, No, that says unmanaged switch, not switch. We're looking for hub. You might still be able to buy hubs, probably not. You might encounter a hub. A hub looks like a switch. It might have 4, 8, 16, some number of 2 ports on it. The way a hub works.
Sorry, what is the difference between port and the switch?
I'm going to tell you right now. A port, okay, so do you see that first picture on the screen here that I keep highlighting, hovering over? A port is one hole going into that device. This is an electrical device that you plug into the wall to provide DC power on each one of these ports. That is port 1, port 2, port 3, port 4, 5, etc. If this was a hub device, I'm not saying this is probably a switch. It takes the signal coming into the Ethernet, or excuse me, the Cat5e wire that's plugged into this port, electrically reproduces it, takes the frequency off that wire, reproduces that frequency across the other 4 ports. So if anything comes into any of these ports, it basically electrically reproduces it. Doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter what the frequency is, doesn't matter what the data is, it doesn't know. In other words, hubs only operate at layer 1. Not very common. You might see them in third world countries. You might see them in old people's houses, okay? I think I have a hub or 2 lying around. At layer 2, we use interconnecting devices called switches, or a switch. Much more common. Actually, I should say most common. A switch is the most common interconnecting device. Even more common than a wireless access point, which is also a switch. How much do switches cost? Well, you can go down to Office Depot or Amazon.com and buy a 4 or 8 port switch for 20 bucks. They're really cheap. They didn't used to be cheap, but they're much, much cheaper. They work at layer 2. Now let's go back and look at the PowerPoint, for example, just a minute. Hubs and switches. Link cabling, and there are coax hubs and coax switches, but most of them are Ethernet. There are fiber optic switches as well. They're different ports. It's not that Cat5e RJ45 thing. It's either an SFP or an SPP, or there's different physical connections. Access points, I'll briefly just mention what an access point is. The correct term is actually wireless access point, or WAP. We don't use that term WAP anymore. We just take off the W and we say an access point is basically any device that doesn't have physical ports, or might have one physical port on it. It uses radio waves and has antennas on it. Some access points have external physical antennas that you can see. Some do not have antennas that you can see, but there are definitely antennas in every access point. It's a piece of metal that extends away from the device to be able to pick up and receive radio signals. They are transceivers. I mentioned that power over Ethernet earlier. Power flows over unused twisted pair. That's how we get the power over Ethernet. IP cameras, phones, usually not laptops or workstations, but small devices that you need to power your Ring alarm systems, things like that. Again, these are really super duper old pictures. I'm going to skip software for a minute. Actually, I'll talk just a little bit about software. There used to be network operating software. There's not really network operating software anymore that you put on clients and servers. Anybody ever heard of the company called Novell? And I'll get back to this in just a minute, in the complexity. I know I'm jumping around, but that's what I do. It's what I do best. I jump around. I'm the frog of networking. Novell. They used to be one of the largest companies in the world. Anybody ever heard of Novell? Just don't make me a liar, say no, I never heard of them. They were like Microsoft. They had 97% of the networking market, and then IBM and a couple of other companies had like 3% of the market. And that's because networking did not used to be built in to your computer or your operating system. You had to go buy it. That's how Novell made money. And then Microsoft, with the advent of XP, added the network stack into their code, not layer 3 yet, but layer 2, and it kind of made NetWare not necessary. And so that company essentially died and went away. So when we refer to network operating software, we're not typically talking about software that we run on our workstations or on our servers, because it's typically built into the OS. But we do have network operating software that we run within our switches and our interconnecting devices, like Cisco has their own software. It's called iOS. Juniper has JuneOS. And then there's other generic hardware that you can buy, and you can run networking software. It's usually firewall software that you buy and run on a piece of equipment. I'll skip that. Okay, let me go back to before I go too much more into wired Ethernet, I want to describe to you these different layers. Let me blow this up, because these are different hardware types that you're interconnecting. I know I'm spelling that wrong. Interconnecting network devices. Hub, not common. Switch, very common. You go buy those 20, 30 bucks. Amazon, Office Depot. At layer 3, those are called routers. Switches are intelligent, but they do not need programming. They work at layer 2 only, and they learn for you where everybody lives. Routers work at layer 3, and they do need programming. We put IP addresses in those, okay? Routers work at layer 3, 2, and 1. Switches work at 2 and 1. And then the next level up from that, and you actually do have things called smart switches or managed switches, which work at layer 3. So they would be lumped in there. At layer 4 or 5, layer 4 and 5, you have devices like gateways, or gateways, excuse me, gateway. A gateway device is usually defined, and this is not in the book, by the way. This is on the internet, not in my head. Gateway devices are devices that are generally providing multiple services. They are being a switch for you. They're being a wireless access point. By the way, an access point, where do you think that falls into? APs are layer 2. Wireless access points are not layer 3. You connect to a wireless access point, you go to SSID UH wireless, and you establish a communication with the wireless device up on the ceiling in the classroom you're in, or the wireless device at your home. You are having a layer 2 communication between you and that wireless access point. It's passing transparently IP traffic, but it's got to go to something else, like a router, to get it somewhere. Now, some APs are also routers, but the standalone ones that you stick on the ceiling, the little round ones that look like fire extinguisher or fire alarms, those are just layer 2. Layer 3 are routers. You do need to program those. Layer 4 and 5 are gateway devices. These are typically, and by the way, what routers do is they connect 2 or more, sometimes dissimilar networks. Together. Not always dissimilar. Sometimes it's Ethernet on one side, Ethernet on the other side, LAN to WAN, for example. But a lot of times it's a different networking physical layer protocol, coax to Ethernet, for example, or wireless to wired. In the case of a gateway, that's what most of you have at home. I'm sorry, my spelling is terrible today. Not my spelling, my typing. My typing's terrible. Providing multiple services. Gateways are being routers and wireless access points and switches and certainly hubs. You physically connect to them. But they're also doing other things like providing DHCP, DNS, firewall, where they're protecting the data. They're looking at the IP addresses and the port numbers. That's why I say they operate at layer 4. And they can operate at layer 5. Those are called gateways. So if I were to ask you on the exam, by the way, on exam 2, hint, hint, that's why I'm pointing this out, conceptually, the complexity between all these different devices, list them in complexity from least complex to most complex in terms of coding. Well, hubs have no coding because they work at layer 1. Switches have very simple coding because they only look at MAC addresses. Routers are a little bit more complex because they look at MAC addresses too, but they look at IP addresses. And then gateways look at content. Or maybe just at layer 4, they're looking at the port number. They're actually looking at what the, maybe not actually what the content is, like the content of your email, but they will be able to tell that there is email going on because they're looking at the port number, like port 125 or port 139. These port numbers that we use for email. Okay, so keep that item in mind. Simplest to most complex. Okay, back to PowerPoint real quick here. See how we're doing on time. We're doing okay. I want to speed up a little bit here. I'm going slow because I'm hitting some stuff that's actually in the backbone chapter 2 now. Wired Ethernet, the original IEEE. You can go look up who IEEE is. It stands for the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. You can be a member if you're an engineer. 802.3 is the original Ethernet standard. Actually, that's not true. 802.2 is the original Ethernet standard. Today's Ethernet standard is called 802.3. That's the wired standard. The wireless Ethernet standard is called 802. What? Anybody know? 802.11. I'm sure you guys have seen that printed on boxes of wireless access points. 802.11, and then there will be subcategories of that, like 802.11G, N, A, AC, 802.11AX. Nowadays, we're getting away from that. We're just calling it, Generation 6 and things like that. Originally developed by Digital Equipment Corporation, Intel, and Xerox. In other words, I mentioned this before, Ethernet was invented by a bunch of dicks. Sorry, I think it's funny. It's amusing to me. Layer 2 protocol. Physical layer, of course, is used because, like I said, in order to be layer 2, you have to first have surpassed layer 1. Okay. Topology. Topology is how the devices are physically and logically laid out. Basic geographic layout of a network. This is called a ring network. Excuse me. Ring network. You don't really see a lot of LANs that are built like this. There used to be LANs like this, like broken token ring. This is what most LANs look like, a star topology, where there's an interconnecting device, not necessarily directly in the middle, but it conceptually it looks like it's in the middle if you were to draw out a map of devices in your home or your business. And each device on the network communicates only directly with this interconnecting device. No two devices are physically connected together. No two clients, no two servers, no two hubs. No, excuse me, no two hosts. Now the original Ethernet looked like this. In fact, the original Ethernet 802.2 specification was a bus network. And I mentioned bus in the last class, but I didn't talk much about it. Bus network. Only 5 connections. Every computer was literally physically attached to every other computer with a daisy chain situation. There would literally be a cable coming into your office on one side. You plug into the back of your computer on one port, and then you had a second port on the back of your computer that plugged into the cable that ran over the other wall into the next dude's office. it's called daisy chaining or hub, worked fine for little networks. In fact, like I said, the original Ethernet specification allowed 5 nodes on your LAN. You can have more than 5 network devices. The router at your house, Franklin, I don't know what it is. It probably is a gateway. Does it have antennas sticking out of it? And can you log into it and set up VPN, things like that? Yeah, it's probably a gateway. That's why Comcast calls it a business gateway and AT&T calls it a gateway modem.
Okay, thank you.
That's what Ethernet originally looked like. Pros and cons to that. Well, the pros to that is it doesn't require any interconnecting devices. I don't need a switch. All I need is cable. Cons to that are, let's say this guy here decides he wants to take his computer home for the weekend so he can play Pong on it or whatever games were popular back in the 80s and 90s. He does that, he breaks the chain. This computer A here can no longer talk to computer C, D, and E because there no longer is a daisy chain. Daisy chaining is typically bad, and the only reason we ever do daisy chaining in the networking world, because we do still occasionally do it, is because it's either difficult to get cabling from point A to point Z, so we go to point A, B, C, D, E, and then eventually to point Z, or it's temporary. This is what most Ethernet, or most networking, not necessarily Ethernet, but most networking looks like. It's a star topology. In the case of hubs, this is where the data was electrically reproduced. A message that was generated by host A intended for host C would be electrically created. It would go to the hub on, let's say, port 1, for example. That hub would electrically recreate that message and send it out the other 4 ports, actually the other 5 ports, to all the other devices on the network. Whether that frame, remember we're at layer 2, whether that frame was intended for those other devices or not, it didn't matter. It still got them. Now your NOS, your network operating software, was told, if the MAC address, if the destination address that's in this frame that you just received, if it's not yours, ignore it. Don't look at it. Unfortunately, that was insecure and inefficient. It was insecure because if you had access to your network operating software, you could sometimes enable what's called promiscuous mode and tell your network card to go ahead and look at every single frame that's being received by you, whether it was for you or not. Not only was it insecure, it's inefficient. If, for example, you're trying to have a conversation with one other person in the room and you're hearing 5 other conversations go on because everybody's standing 2 inches from each other, and there's no other situation, you can't move those people away, you can't zone them out. That's inefficient, causes collisions, causes excess traffic. It's slow. So hubs, not good. We use switches instead. They physically look like the same thing, but now they have processors in them. They have memory in them. They have code in those processors. They don't usually have hard drives. They usually just have little, it's kind of like using a USB stick with data on it. There's code in here. Code says, hey, if you get a frame, if computer A with a certain MAC address created a message with the destination address which has been associated with computer C, and the way that association happens, by the way, is this device learns where everybody is. It's going to only send that message to computer C and not send it to everybody else. So 1, the security is there. 2, the speed is there because I haven't recreated that message for these other 3 nodes that don't need to get it. So I've cleared up the network by not sending out unnecessary messages. Now, how does this happen, you might ask? Well, when you first turn your computer on, let's say your computer A, you first turn your computer on, a frame is sent to the switch. The switch notices, let's pretend you're connected to port 1 right here. The switch notices, hey, I just got a frame from MAC address of 00-0A-2B- whatever on port 1. Let me create a table and make note of that. So the next time that I get a message intended for computer A for that MAC address, I'll know, oh, I just need to send that directly to port 1. Don't need to bother looking. Is he on port 2, 3, 4, 5? It's called a MAC address table or an ARP table. Switches are intelligent to some degree. They learn, and this is important, it's a very important concept to understand. Switches learn the MAC addresses. You don't have to program them, but the learning is good. Occasionally MAC addresses change or people connect things into different ports on switches, and sometimes your networking has issues. We tell people if you're having issues where network traffic's not passing at any higher layers, and the way we usually know it is up at the application layer. Data's not changing. The customer goes, oh, I'm not getting new web pages. My internet seems down. Power cycle your switch, because your switch probably has a poisoned or an inaccurate MAC table. MAC addresses. So switches learn. They make little tables which look like this. It says port 1 has that MAC address. Port 2 has that MAC address. 3 is that. 4 is that. There might be in fact, most switches can handle multiple MAC addresses per port because you can daisy chain switches together. One switch can talk to another switch, and there might be 100 MACs coming in on one port. It learns that. It figures that out. Don't worry about different kinds of switching. Just skip that. I mentioned already before, Ethernet really is called carrier sense multiple access with collision detection and collisions and avoidance. It's too long, so we just call it Ethernet. It's a shorter term. I already talked about this. I jumped ahead and talked about this. 802.11. Wi-Fi uses radio frequencies, has many benefits. And bear in mind there are pros and cons to Wi-Fi. The pros: provides network connections to where cabling is impossible or inconvenient or not necessary or expensive. Cabling. One of the most expensive things you can do is to retro install cabling in a building. Once the walls are up in a building, it's very expensive to put those cables in because you have to, first of all, you can't see anything. You might be hitting something in the wall if you try to run cable, or there might be, cross beams in the wall that you can't easily get through. So we always try to put the wiring in before the walls are up in a building, like maybe one side's up. Negatives: what are the discounts to Wi-Fi? What are the bad? What's the bad on Wi-Fi? It's not secure. We can't control where radio waves go. It's not particularly fast because it's radiated media. I know it seems fast, but again, with that situation with my friend this weekend where he was having choppy viewing of his Netflix and CBS All Access, had nothing to do with his internet connection. His internet connection was great. It was because he was using wireless networking. In his case, there was already wires. He should have used wiring. There are different kinds of antenna types. Most of you, in fact, I'm sure all of you, have omnidirectional antennas. Omni means all. Omnidirectional antennas is basically just a single pole sticking up in the air, and radio waves get into that pole and come out of that pole in every direction. Then you have unidirectional or bidirectional or sector-based antennas where the frequencies are sent out only in a very narrow beam. Some of them look like satellite dishes. Some of them look like flat panels. You can send those radio signals much further if you can concentrate where they're going. We use unidirectional or directional, I should say, directional antennas when we need to send radio waves much further distances. Now, does anybody have any idea what the approximate average range of 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi is with your standard laptops and standard access points that you have at home? How far away can you walk from your house? This is another experiment you can do. Get on your Wi-Fi, walk out your front door while you're running some application like Wi-Fi Analyzer, or you're streaming or whatever, and see at what point it starts getting choppy. 50 feet, maybe more. It depends on your house. Depends on whether if you have a 2-story house and the device is upstairs, higher up, you're probably going to get a couple 100 feet away. It also depends on how much more crap is in your neighborhood. Not crap, but how much more radio frequency crap, or noise we call it, is in your neighborhood. But I have got directional antennas installed in RV parks specifically that send the 2.4 gigahertz, actually even the 5.0 gigahertz frequencies a mile away, 2 miles away, one side of the RV park to the other, and I'm getting 200, 300 megabit per second throughput. And that's because they look like antennas. They look like parabolic dishes, and they're concentrating the radio waves closer to each other. So yeah, radio wave. Another bad thing about radio Wi-Fi is it's variable. Sometimes the Wi-Fi is great, sometimes it's not. It depends on, how many cars are in your driveway, or if you have a party going on in your house. It's not that there's a bunch of people on your Wi-Fi, it's that there's a bunch of big bags of water in your house. Humans are mostly bags of water. Radio waves don't pass very well through big bags of water. A wireless topology of physically a star, it's still logically a bus, but it's physically a star. You can go look that up in the notes. I need to skip through a little bit faster. Frame. Wireless frames look just like Ethernet wired frames. Here's the two ranges. Again, we're not talking right at 2.4 or right at 5.0. It's a narrow range of channels. In 2.4, you've only got 3 overlapping channels, 1, 6, and 11. Or is it 1, 6, and 12? I can't remember. I think it's 1, 6, and 12. At 5 gigahertz, you have 12 or many more overlapping channels. 5 gigahertz, the only reason it's better is because there's less in it. And there are more channels, but you can't get as far with it. As long as there's clear line of sight, you can. But if there's something in the way, a human or a plane, not a plane, a building or a cow or a wall, things are going to go slower at 5G. Here's some different, and you probably should memorize this chart or have this chart handy when you take exam 2, hint, hint. 802.11ax is the most recent specification, but now we're just calling, we've changed. IEEE doesn't call it this anymore. 802.11ax has now been rebranded as Wi-Fi 6. Has anybody purchased a wireless access point or gateway for their home recently? Or if you're in the market for one, make sure you're paying attention to what's printed on the box. Ignore all of that AC 1200, AC 3200, or whatever. That's an arbitrary number, which is a combination of the number of antennas and the maximum frequency range. Go by this. Go by the 802 rating. So if it's 802.11ad, it's probably a couple $100. If it's Wi-Fi 6, it's probably at least $300 for that wireless access point. But you can get much faster speeds through it. Anybody have one of these Monster Gaming? I've got one at home. It looks like a spaceship. It's about 4 pounds and it has 8 antennas sticking out of it. It's so that I can be way in the back of my yard and still get Wi-Fi, and I can have 50 people over if we want to have, network parties, for example. But it was like $300. I need to stop here. I thought I could get a little bit further, but I talked too much about wireless and Wi-Fi, and it is important. It's stuff that you do need to know for exam 2. So we'll finish up chapter 7 tomorrow. Definitely finish chapter 8 tomorrow. Oh, wait a minute. Is today? Yeah, today's Thursday. So tomorrow, definitely having class. Okay, I'll answer those questions, Ali. I'll answer them tomorrow. Let me go ahead and finish up. And if you do have any questions, please hold them. Email me if you have any questions, whether it's regarding today's content or the exam or homework assignments. Email them to me, and I'll try to be diligent as I can in getting those emails read and answered. Not just read, but answered. I read all the emails. I don't necessarily answer them all immediately. Where's my sharing? I'm gonna get rid of my chat window. Stop share. So I'll see you guys tomorrow at 2 to 2:15. Sometimes I have to start a little bit late. But I should be able to start by 2 tomorrow. So I'll see you guys tomorrow on Zoom. Thank you.